When I opened that forgotten box in the basement, I was only looking for wires and old parts to throw away. The smell of mold and rust rose like an old warning, the kind you learn to ignore over the years. Amid cables, screws, and manuals curled in on themselves, there was a cracked, dirty cassette tape case. No label. I picked it up on instinct without knowing why. On the faded sticker, somehow still clinging to the plastic despite the humidity, there were only 2 words: Itapeva, 1978. I took the tape to the old deck in my living room, a machine I keep more out of nostalgia than usefulness. When I pressed play, I expected the usual, amateur voices, homemade recordings, maybe a poorly captured song from the radio. What came out of the speakers was none of that. First, the familiar hiss, vibrating with the uneven breath of aging magnetic tape. Then, a sequence of sharp tones, too precise to be interference, too wrong to belong to any known station. I adjusted the volume. The air in the room seemed to draw back, as if waiting for something. And then I heard the voice. It wasn't exactly a voice. It was an attempt, an effort. Twisted syllables emerging from the static, shifting between the human and the impossible, as if something were trying to imitate the way we speak. Learning in real time, the sound seemed to react to the room as though it sensed that someone decades later had finally pressed play again. "Are you listening?" the recording scraped out. At that exact moment, I realized this wasn't a normal tape. It wasn't some clandestine broadcast, nor atmospheric interference. It was a transmission, one that should never have been captured, one that somehow had found its way to me, and one that had been waiting 47 years to be heard. Again, it took me months to accept that the tape needed to be studied. At first, I treated the discovery as a strange coincidence, one of those relics that age forgotten in basements and only return to light by some whim of fate. But as I replayed the recording, night after night, something asserted itself in every second captured. It wasn't just a historical fragment. It wasn't simply an old piece of audio. It was a call, a request, or perhaps a test. And the more I listened, the more I realized the tape wasn't only trying to reveal a lost transmission. It seemed to be trying to reveal me to whoever had recorded it. The faded label said only Itapeva, 1978, but that detail carried weight. I worked at the city's old radio station that year. I stood in those same rooms, in front of those same receivers, listening to the same type of static that fills the small hours of any broadcast. But I had never heard this. None of us had. The tape didn't belong to the station's official archive, nor to the informal collection we kept hidden from supervisors. It was something external, something intercepted, and somehow preserved, as if it had been waiting for the exact moment it would be found. The most unsettling part, however, was the structure of the transmission. Even with simple equipment, I could tell the audio didn't behave like anything terrestrial. The shifting frequencies, the formation of syllables, the intervals of absolute silence. Nothing matched human speech, natural phenomena, or military interference. It felt closer to a learning process, as if someone or something were trying to shape a language out of noise. The tape wasn't documenting a clandestine program. It was witnessing the birth of a voice. In time, I began tracing everything that happened in Itapeva during that winter. I combed through old newspapers, maintenance reports, police records, station logs. Nothing mentioned pirate broadcasts, unusual interference, or any clandestine radio activity. It was as if the tape had no official or unofficial origin, as if it had been recorded by someone who didn't want to be found, or by someone who didn't know they were transmitting. When I realized the audio seemed to respond to me, even after 4 decades without contact, I understood that investigation was no longer a matter of technical curiosity. The tape contained something alive, perhaps not in the biological sense, but in the most dangerous sense, intent. If that recording was made in 1978, it was never meant to exist. If someone captured it, they didn't want it discovered. And if whatever speaks through it is still listening, then maybe it never stopped. In 1978, Itapeva felt smaller than any map suggested. At night, the town folded into itself early, swallowed by a darkness that didn't depend solely on the lack of streetlights. The cobblestone roads reflected the weak glow of the lamps, as if afraid to disturb it. In shuttered windows, home radios whispered filtered news. Rehearsed programs restrained music. I was 25 and worked as a technician at the local station, a two-story building that groaned with every gust of wind. There, between hot valves and exposed wiring, I believed I understood every sound the airwaves could produce. I was wrong. When the station's clock marked the end of the broadcast day, always around 11:30, the town already seemed abandoned. While the announcers gathered their papers and turned off the lights, I headed to the back equipment room. It was my solitary ritual. A second receiver, more sensitive than the main broadcast unit, stayed on exclusively for testing. Surrounded by the transformer's hum and the metallic smell of ozone, I slowly turned the dial, mapping frequencies like someone exploring unknown caves. What I recorded in my notebooks had no official value, but to me it was the invisible cartography of the night. On that particular night, winter pressed heavily over Itapeva. The wind howled along the side of the building and brought with it a smell of wet earth and burning firewood from distant houses. I was tuning the receiver to a dead zone between two stations no one paid attention to when something stopped. Me. The static wasn't uniform. It pulsed. It breathed, as if it held cadence in tension, a buried logic hidden in the texture of the noise. I leaned closer, lowered the gain, refined the tuning. The pattern reorganized itself, obedient, almost receptive, as though it knew I was trying to hear it. With an instinct I still can't explain, I pulled one of the reel-to-reel recorders from the shelf, connected the cables, and began to capture the sound. The tape moved slowly, snaking through the spools while that signal transformed. First came the intervals of absolute silence, so abrupt they seemed pulled from the tape by an invisible force. Then between those perfect voids, fragments of voice emerged. Not sentences, not words, attempts, as if someone somewhere were testing combinations of phonetics, exploring frequencies like someone fumbling along a dark wall searching for a way out. Nothing about it was random. I felt that before I understood it. At 12:10, everything changed. The noise stopped, not muffled, not softened, but cut, as if ripped out of existence. A 2-second pause stretched into eternity. Then 3 sharp tones echoed through the headphones, perfectly aligned, perfectly repeated. A test tone from a station that didn't exist. The tape was capturing everything, and I couldn't look away from the needles trembling on the panel. When the silence returned, it wasn't empty. It was charged with expectation. And that was when I heard the first attempt at speech coming through that frequency. A sound belonging to no language on earth. A sound that seemed to be searching for me. The morning after that recording, I told no one. At the station, the routine continued with its predictable choreography, stale coffee, the smell of hot dust on the console, the same voices repeating announcements as if the world would collapse without them. I worked mechanically, but my thoughts kept circling back to the tape I had stored in my desk drawer. Every few minutes, I felt the need to check whether it was still there, as if it could disappear on its own. Or worse, as if someone else might be looking for it. When my shift ended, instead of going home, I walked to the town's public library. It was nearly empty, as always. Most people in Itapeva relied on gossip, not records. I, however, needed something more concrete. I searched through dusty binders of technical bulletins, government memos, and reports of radio interference from the decade. Nothing resembled what I had heard. No atmospheric disturbances recorded, no military exercises, no pirate broadcasters. The silence in the documents mirrored the silence in town, as if both had agreed to pretend nothing unusual had ever happened there. I widened my search. Meteorological data. Astronomy logs from amateur observers. notes from local ham radio operators. The pattern repeated itself. Normalcy, stability, predictability, the kind of consistency that feels manufactured rather than natural. It was as though every trace of anything strange had been smoothed out or erased. The few who might have noticed something, an operator who logged an odd spike, a hobbyist who heard a strange tone, either never recorded it or were encouraged to keep quiet. Nothing contradicted the official story. Itapeva, 1978, a quiet place with quiet nights. Except I knew better. That night, back home, I played the tape again. I wanted to understand what I had actually captured. I closed the curtains, dimmed the lights, and connected the recorder to my best set of headphones. The signal behaved the same way. The breathing static, the patterned silences, the fragments of proto-speech. But there was something new I hadn't noticed during the first listening. After the third attempt at forming a syllable, there was a small fluctuation, a dip in frequency that resembled a response. Not mine. Its. I rewound and played it repeatedly. The pattern was unmistakable. Whenever my breathing quickened, whenever my fingers brushed the metal housing of the recorder, the signal shifted by fractions of a hertz. Not random, not environmental, reactive. A signal shouldn't be able to listen. A recording shouldn't be able to recognize the person playing it. Yet that was exactly what it felt like. Something on that tape was aware of being heard again after all those years, and worse, it seemed to be adjusting itself to me. I decided to test a theory. If the signal reacted to me, then perhaps it reacted to any form of input. I set up my old frequency generator, the one I used in my early days at the station, and connected it to the tape deck. I emitted a sequence of pure tones, soft at first, then gradually increasing in complexity. The tape responded. Not immediately, not dramatically, but in subtle shifts, like a sleeper adjusting to a new sound in the room. The realization hit me slowly, like cold water dripping down the spine. The entity captured on that tape wasn't trying to communicate with the world. It was trying to communicate with me. I spent the next hours cross-referencing those reactions with my old notes from 1978. Back then, I was just a young technician desperate to prove myself. I had stayed late many nights, experimenting with antennas, amplifiers, and signal mapping systems the supervisors never approved. One of those experiments involved intercepting stray frequencies from old military channels. I remember thinking it was harmless, a young man's curiosity. But as I compared my logs to the tape's behavior, an unsettling hypothesis emerged. Whatever was speaking now might have first heard me all those decades ago. Suddenly, half-forgotten memories resurfaced. Nights when the static felt too dense. A moment when my headphones vibrated without any electrical reason. The faint impression, long dismissed, that something had whispered behind me in the studio, though the room was empty. I had blamed exhaustion and caffeine at the time. But what if that wasn't imagination? What if that was the first attempt of the same voice now trapped inside the tape? A voice that was learning, evolving, waiting. I replayed a specific section of the tape, the one where the voice seemed closest to forming a recognizable word. As the syllables warped inside my headphones, I felt a shift in the air, the same almost imperceptible pressure drop that precedes a storm. But there was no storm. Just my house, silent and still. Then came the sensation I dreaded most, the feeling of being watched. Not by a person, not by eyes, but by attention. Focus. As if the voice inside the recording had finally realized that I was listening with full intent and wanted to meet that intent halfway. In that moment, I understood the true nature of what I had uncovered. This wasn't merely a forgotten broadcast or an experimental frequency accident. It was the remnant of a contact, an incomplete one, interrupted before it could take shape, Whatever had reached out in 1978 had never stopped trying. It had simply been waiting for the right listener to return. And now that I had pressed play again, it was no longer a passive recording. It was an open door. The deeper I dug into my old archives, the more a pattern began to form, not in the tape itself, but in my memories. And that, more than anything, terrified me. We trust memory the way sailors trust stars, as fixed points to navigate by. But mine began to wobble. Entire nights from 1978 felt blurred, as if something had scraped away details I should have remembered. Conversations with colleagues, test logs I clearly wrote, but could no longer recall writing, gaps in time that no technical explanation could fill. It felt as though the past itself had been edited, leaving behind seams where the truth used to be. One entry in my old notebook stood out. A page dated July 14th, 1978, a date I had no memory of, documenting an abrupt external frequency spike, precisely at 2312. The handwriting was unmistakably mine. The technical description was thorough, but the final sentence made my blood freeze. Contact attempted, response unknown. The phrase didn't match any protocol I'd ever used. I had no recollection of writing it. And yet, there it was, in my own pen, like a message from a version of me I no longer recognized. When I played the tape again, those missing fragments of memory fluttered at the edges of awareness, like moths circling a dim bulb. The voice, or whatever approximation of a voice lived inside that recording, sounded different now, more coordinated, less hesitant, as if replaying the tape allowed it to refine itself, feeding off repetition. I adjusted the equalizer, isolating the mid-range frequencies. Underneath the warped syllables, I detected something new, a faint harmonic signature, like an echo of my own voice layered inside the static. That discovery unraveled me. Had the entity mimicked me? Or was it returning something I had once sent without realizing? The windows of my house reflected my silhouette in the darkened glass, and for a split second I could swear the reflection moved out of sync, delayed by a fraction of a second, like a broadcast lagging behind its source. My breath fogged the window, but the fog pattern didn't match the rhythm of my exhale. I stepped back, heart pounding. The tape was still playing, the syllables shaping themselves, closer, clearer. Then came the moment I still struggled to describe. The recording shifted mid-playback, altering itself in real time. The static thinned out as though being peeled away. A single phrase emerged, unmistakably human in structure, but impossible in tone, a warped mirror of my own timbre. "Are you there?" The room went silent except for my own pulse. I stopped the tape, but the question lingered, vibrating in the air, in the walls, inside my skull, and I realized something crucial. This thing wasn't bound to the recording. The tape was merely the vessel. The message was ongoing. Sleep became impossible after that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw oscillation patterns instead of dreams, waveforms rippling across a black background as if trying to assemble themselves into sentences. I stopped playing the tape for a while, hoping distance would silence whatever had awakened. But the silence only amplified it. Electrical hums in the house felt different. Streetlights flickered as I passed them. Even the refrigerator's motor seemed to pulse, in the same rhythm as the voice that had spoken from the static. It was as though my world had begun to tune itself to a frequency I had once intercepted. Desperate for clarity, I returned to my old equipment. The receivers, the antenna schematics, the notebooks I had kept throughout the 1970s. If I could retrace my steps, maybe I could rebuild a timeline untouched by the distortions in my memory. But the deeper I looked, the more inconsistencies I found. Schematics marked with annotations that weren't mine, pages rewritten in handwriting that resembled mine but leaned in strange directions, letters bending unnaturally, as if the writer had learned penmanship by imitation rather than understanding. And yet, the technical details were flawless, almost too flawless. One late afternoon, while reviewing a bundle of old frequency logs, I noticed a pattern, a series of readings from 1978 matching the exact pitch and interval of the 3 tones heard at the beginning of the tape. They weren't isolated events. They appeared for 7 consecutive nights. I cross-referenced the dates with local power fluctuations, weather data, and maintenance schedules. Nothing explained the repetition. It was deliberate. It was structured. Someone, or something, had been transmitting with intention long before I ever pressed record. As evening settled, I allowed myself to play the tape again. The room dimmed as the sun sank behind the trees, and the first hiss of static filled the air like dust shaken from an old book. The tones played as expected. The warped syllables followed, but something else emerged beneath them, faint, muffled, like a voice speaking from underwater. I boosted the gain, careful not to distort the signal. Slowly, the words resolved into something unmistakable, coordinates. Not geographical ones, at least not in any terrestrial system. They were arranged like star positions, but inverted, as though plotted from a vantage point far from Earth. My hands trembled as I paused the playback, the coordinates repeated, cycling through the tape like a mantra. But that wasn't what terrified me most. What froze my breath was realizing that I had seen those numbers before, scribbled in the margins of my old notebook, dated months before the supposed recording night. It meant one of 2 things, both unbearable. Either I had been receiving transmissions long before I remembered, or something had been dictating them to me. And the worst possibility hovered at the edge of thought. What if the voice on the tape wasn't trying to contact us? What if it had already found someone, and that someone had been me? In the days that followed, I became increasingly aware that the tape was no longer a relic I had discovered. It was a thread, pulling me towards something I had once tried to forget. The boundaries between past and present began to blur. I'd wake with the sense of having listened to the transmission during the night, even though the tape deck remained untouched. Sometimes I'd find the reels slightly misaligned, or the counter set to a different position. At first, I blamed my memory. Then I blamed exhaustion. But the shifts were too precise, too purposeful, as if someone had been using the machine while I slept. I turned to the only method I trusted: isolation. For years I had trained myself to read interference patterns like other people read facial expressions. I unplugged everything that wasn't essential, shielded the windows, and grounded the equipment manually. Slowly, the noise floor stabilized. The house fell into a silence so thick it felt padded. And yet, beneath that silence, I sensed a pressure, not auditory, not physical, but a presence pressing inward, waiting for the moment I'd let my guard down. There was no logical explanation for it, but logic had begun to feel like a tool too small for what I was dealing with. One night, unable to resist, I fed the tape into the deck again. This time, I monitored not just the audio, but the electromagnetic activity in the room. Midway through the playback, the lights dimmed. The air vibrated. The readings spiked in a way that matched nothing earthly. Not storms, not static discharge, not even solar interference. And then the voice came through, clearer than ever. It didn't struggle to form syllables anymore. It didn't imitate language. It spoke, softly distorted but unmistakably directed at me. You recorded this before you forgot. The room contracted around me. My breath stuttered. I stopped the tape, rewound it, played the segment again. Nothing. Just hiss. No voice, no message. As if it had spoken only once, only to me, bypassing the magnetic strip entirely. I fell to the floor, shaken by a realization that grew like frost spreading across glass. Whatever had transmitted in 1978 had not finished its conversation, and perhaps it never intended to communicate through radio waves alone. The tape was not just a record, it was a conduit, a familiar doorway, reopening after decades of silence. Then the house went dark, a complete blackout. Yet in the pitch-black room, the tape deck's VU meters glowed faintly, even though the machine had no independent power source. The needles rose, responding to a sound I could not hear. Slowly, methodically, they peaked in a pattern I recognized. The pattern of a heartbeat, but not mine, not human. Something else was in the room, moving just outside perception, broadcasting on a frequency meant for me alone. And in that trembling moment, I understood the final truth. I had not rediscovered the tape. It had returned to me. I didn't sleep the night the tape returned to life. I sat in the dark, watching the VU meters faintly pulse, long after the blackout ended, their glow fading only with the first light of morning. I thought about throwing the tape away, smashing it, burning it, but I knew none of that would matter. Whatever had spoken through it no longer needed the cassette. The transmission had already crossed over. It wasn't bound to magnetic tape or radio waves anymore. It had found something else to inhabit, something it had touched before, something it could return to again. In the weeks since, I've tried to rebuild a sense of normalcy, but the world refuses to settle back into place. Electrical hums still follow me. Streetlights flicker in familiar rhythms. And sometimes, just before sleep, I feel the air shift, a subtle, almost polite reminder that the conversation isn't over. Maybe it never will be. The coordinates I found scribbled in my old notebook still don't match any known chart. But I've stopped trying to decipher them. Some knowledge doesn't illuminate, it corrodes. I keep the tape stored in a locked drawer now, though I'm certain the drawer is meaningless. Its presence presses through wood and metal as easily as it once slipped through static. I've come to understand that 1978 wasn't the beginning of this story. It was simply the moment I noticed. Whatever reached out through those frequencies had chosen me long before that winter, and perhaps long before I was old enough to understand what it meant to be chosen. So I'm recording all of this now, not to seek help or absolution, but to leave a trace. A warning, maybe, or proof that for a brief moment something beyond our comprehension tried to speak in a language we were never meant to hear. If you're listening to this, remember one thing. Signals don't vanish. They wander. They wait. And sometimes they find their way back. If one night you hear a pattern in the static, 3 sharp tones perfectly spaced, don't follow the instinct to adjust the dial. Don't lean closer. Don't let curiosity rearrange your fear. Because once you hear the attempt at a voice behind the noise, once you recognize that it's learning, mimicking, calling, it's already too late. You're no longer the receiver. You're the frequency.